Doesn't the Bible promote slavery? This is a really good question, and it's one that I got not too long ago when I was at a university speaking on the reliability of the Bible. Someone in the Q&A time raised the question of, all good and well, you've presented this information, but doesn't the Bible promote or at least condone slavery? So this is a really big question, and I'll just give a few thoughts on it in three kind of general sections. The first is the terminology that we actually use. The second is the Old Testament, what it says about slavery. And then the third is the New Testament, what it might say about slavery. Let's move to the first. The term slavery. Well, when I think about slavery, and what I've learned in school history and all of that, I get a very bad picture, as we should, about what it is. You see people forcibly removed, put in shackles, taken from their homes, mostly in Africa, and basically made to work without any pay, without any benefits, and completely dehumanized. And basically they would stay slaves until the day that they die. So that's maybe the picture that we get. This is the East India slave trade. This is maybe what we see in the past in the South of America. And this is the picture that is forefront of our minds when we hear the word slavery. But is that what we see in the Bible? I think that's where we need to start. So let's look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament is written against the backdrop of the ancient Near East cultures, essentially, looking at the cultures of Egypt and Babylon. And so it's written into that to the people of Israel. And essentially all the laws and the things that we see that God tells the people of Israel are there to help them set up themselves as a nation. These are the guidelines for them as a nation and how they're supposed to interact with the cultures around them and interact amongst themselves. So that's the context that the Old Testament is written into. And now when we see the word slavery, it's not actually pointing to something that we see in the modern slavery that we're used to today, where there's human trafficking and all of those sorts of things. But it's rather something more akin to indentured servitude. So it wasn't something that was driven by race, but something more driven by someone's financial status. Maybe they found themselves in poverty, maybe they owed someone money and they just couldn't get themselves out of it. And so what they would do is enter into an agreement or a relationship where they then would serve someone and perhaps work in their household for a limited amount of time up until the debt was paid. Now, it's interesting to me that the Old Testament actually gives guidelines on how this is supposed to play out, how the relationship is supposed to work, the protections that are offered for the person who is the slave, which was unheard of in that context. And the slave would actually have to be set free after 6 years. And then if they wanted to, they could enter into a new contract with the household for another 6 years, or even indefinitely if they so desired. Now, why would they do that? Well, they got remuneration from it, they got the security of living in a household, and really interesting to me is that if the owner of the slaves, if the owner of the household didn't have any heirs, the person who was the slave could potentially then become the heir to inheriting what we see in the household, all of the goods and the home itself. So very, very different to what we see in modern day slavery. Now, sometimes when I'm speaking to someone about this, they may say, okay, well, the Bible doesn't completely outlaw slavery, does it? Now, it's interesting that it actually does. In Exodus 21:16, it clearly says that if someone kidnaps a person, they are to be put to death. And if someone is found with a kidnapped person, they too are liable for that penalty. So the Bible unequivocally prohibits slavery in terms of the way that we would understand it today, like human trafficking. So that's the Old Testament. Does the New Testament have anything to say? I mentioned that there's a context to the Old Testament. There's also a context to the New Testament. The New Testament wasn't written where God is setting up these laws and everything to govern the nation of Israel, but rather the New Testament is written into a Roman context where it was Roman rule and where slavery did exist, much like the slavery that we would see around us in the past few centuries and something more like human trafficking. That's the context into which the New Testament is written for the most part. What's fascinating to me is that we have in the New Testament a letter written by the Apostle Paul. The letter is titled Philemon, and it's a letter written to a slave master about his runaway slave who's run away and gone to Paul. And in meeting Paul, he himself has become a Christian. And now Paul says to this slave owner that he's sending Onesimus, the slave, back to him. But he is not to abuse him. He's not to mistreat him. But rather, he is to welcome him back as a brother. Welcome him back as welcoming Paul himself. Paul says he's sending his very heart back with him. And so this is radically different to what we see in the culture around them. And this would have been completely countercultural given the times. So those are just a few thoughts. Does the Bible promote slavery? I think the answer is unequivocally no, it doesn't. It speaks about it, but it doesn't condone it ever at any point, I don't think. So stepping back though, when I consider Christianity and what it's really all about, it's about freedom. The Bible is clear that Christ came to set the captives free. He came to set us free from our brokenness and our, for lack of a better word, sinfulness. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially that we do the things we don't want to do and we can't do the good things that we know we should do. And so God sees this. He sees our brokenness. He sees the state of the world. He sees the ills of the world, and he himself steps in to bring us freedom, that whosoever trusts in him could live this good life, could be found in him and freed by him. So as the African-American author and speaker Lisa Fields puts it, we need to be freed from the sin of slavery and from the slavery of sin. And I think only Christianity brings us that.